Now, so we're going to start today with the functional training, guys. Okay, so now what you need to know, it's about functional training has been, for me, has been a big part of my life, because I started actually very functional, as which I would be a cross-country runner, then moving on to martial arts, and it's based on yeah, that's okay, no problem. I got the message, yeah. So from Liam, yes, no problem. So it's important to actually do functional training, because what we consider as a functional. So I'm going to share with you today a little presentation, and I'm going to talk it through as well. So we're just going to share it, and here we go. And you can, if you have any questions, you can always talk to me about it. So you can type the questions, and I can also email you as well later. So functional training, I will suspension training up here. So we have, what does it mean functional? Okay, so the number one, what we would consider as the functional is something what's useful in our daily lifestyle. So as number one, is very important that functional training has to have application in the normal daily routines. So for example, it has to be number one, it has to be individual. What's functional for one person, a sports person might not be functional for the other. So it has to be very individualized, and it has to help us with daily activities. So for example, when we talk about functional, it has to be able to help us, for example, lifting boxes and making sure that we don't pull our lower back. And it has to also make sure that with daily activities, for example, like going on the toilet is a functional, because we're squatting, then decreased risk of injury. So once the muscles is flexible and mobile also, plus is strong, then that's and that's the purpose of the functional training as well, decrease the risk of injury. Performance improvement, okay, that would be the next one. And then performance, so for everyone who does a little bit functional training, they're able to perform once the muscles getting stronger, flexible, the length stays there as well, then they're able to perform the exercise in a correct pattern, and also they can improve the performance. So it comes to the functional training. So we have it up here, functional training, then evaluation. So like, for example, before, is it really functional when we're actually using equipment? Now, we have to remember that functional training is based on multi-joint function. So lots of even the exercise up here on that presentation, which are they shown, they are based on, as you can see, isolating the muscles. And that's not functional. Functional is the way it's a multi-joint function. So we want to make sure that some of our joints are stable, some of them are also mobile. So now up here we talk about before, in the years ago, when we used to have, when we fitness started in, we had that kind of special equipment, resistance equipment, but that's not really functional when we actually have it, that machines when they put you in. There's something kind of in 1876, you can see up here, he was using a hamstring curl. In 2000, we used to have another hamstring curl machine. And unfortunately, that's not really functional. Functional is when we talk about, when we, for example, use up here now the modern functional, when we're using a stability ball, which then was designed in the 1980s. And in Italy, they actually, the functionality of the ball is way bigger, because you work not only on strength, but also on your stability and also your mobility of the joints as well. So that's a lot of positive in it. So now up here, what we consider as a functional. So for example, we are all born quite functional. So that comes into, we are all born very functional. If you think about it, we don't know anything about us being not functional when we are born. So for example, we always squat very low, we deadlift in a perfect manner. If you see a little baby, how they crawl, how they crawling, how they squatting, how they deadlifting, everything is perfect in the perfect position. So what we're looking for is a strong lumbar spine, nagging in a neutral position, upright torso, knees tracking over and out beyond the toes, increasing the hips below parallel. So you can see as a deep squat. As we get older, unfortunately, we're losing that. So it's about to keep that mobility and also functional patterns. So now up here, what we have a function training is ability to run your load joints, shoulders, hip, ankles, knees throughout functional room without pain, stiffness, restriction with, as you know, load joint articulation. So, for example, what we have it like the person has to be able to perform. Most people are not able to perform a proper squat as they get older. There's a problem with this function, and they might be leaning forward. They might not be able to hold the hips in the right position. They might not be able to keep the knees in line with the toes. And another thing is now the heels might be elevating as well for them because they have no mobility in the ankle joint. So that's quite important that the person is actually performing that exercise in the right pattern and how this should supposed to look. So when we have a low joint articulation, training the body for activity use in the daily life. So for example, you have to think everything what we do in a daily lifestyle, it has to have a kind of like implementation in our training. So for example, if we feel like we would not be doing that in our daily lifestyle, then it does not have a implementation in our daily training. So it has to match, one has to match the other. So it's very important that wherever training we do, it has to be matching. So does it mean that, if you think about that, does it mean that you have to be on the boostable and making yourself unstable and trying to do like single leg squats? That's not really have daily applications. So sometimes we see a lot of movement training, but not necessarily we see a functional training, because I don't see any application of boostable in the daily routines. We're not going to be on quite an unstable surface and try to do squatting, correct? So we have to look into that. What is actually what we call it as a functional training? What is actually in what we consider as a functional, and what is not functional? So because a lot of things which we see, we have a functional training on YouTube and any kind of Instagram and stuff like that you see on social media, is actually necessary, not as a functional and a fundamental. So we need to make sure that our functional training is also fundamental training, fundamental primary mover patterns. So we need to come back to what's very important. What's our primary mover patterns? So which one we have it up here. So we're looking at the little baby, and what you can see, what the baby is doing. So they're crawling, they're squatting, they're deadlifting. They also on a quadruped position, and they also rolling. That's what is a primary mover patterns. For example, I work with disabilities, and what I can see a lot, if that pattern was interrupted or was missing on development of the child into adulthood, we are dealing with dysfunctions. And it's very important that all the patterns are implemented. Doesn't matter if the person is 20, 40, 60, if any of that, it's not, if you can see, so once you're assessing and you cannot see that the person that's actually, the person that doesn't have that primary patterns, then you need to come back and implementing them into the training. So the person can then recruit all the right muscles and all the right joints in the right pattern. So it's very important to sometimes, very often my clients has to do lots of primary mover patterns just to, because they are missing that. Very often kids, for some reasons, let's say they get sick in their childhood, or maybe they were born with some dysfunctions, they missing the pattern of crawling, rolling, and what's happening, you need to implement that for them as they get older in order for them to even walk straight. So function is what we call as a functional. Functional, it must be fundamental. It must have when it's a function, it has to have an application in a daily lifestyle. It has to make sense as well when we're doing the exercise. So it's not like, if you can't talk about, let's say we see a lot of, let's say, animal flow, and we call it like this is a functional. Animal flow is based on an animal pattern, like animal movement pattern. So you see, that's not the human pattern. So let's keep to our species. So like that has to be functional for a person. So what we do when we see animal flow, we see a movement training, but not necessarily 100% was a functional. And what is functional for that, you have to understand that we we dealing lately with a lot of the civilization. So what for you used to be as a fitness instructor, for example, used to be normal to expect for a person to recruit certain movements. Unfortunately, because of our daily lifestyles, the person is not able to perform the task in the right manner. They're not able to recruit the right muscles. They have restrictions. And so that's very important that first of all, we assess and we implement the right pattern for certain individual. So that's what would be considered as a functional. Also, what is important to keep in mind that functional, it has to be based on we want to have a healthy spine, because that's what we're calling. It's like, if you think about it, if we do not have a healthy spine, then degeneration of the spine is going to restrict the movement. So number one would be for what we consider as a functional is to have your healthy spine and delay the process of degeneration because of the spine, because obviously it's going to make to each of us. But then Joseph Pilates said years ago is something very smart, and says you are as young as your spine is flexible. And I 100% agree with that. So let's say if you do have a kind of herniated or bulging discs and stuff like that, that's already restriction of movement. So it's impossible for you to then to be functional. So the most important is to keep the spine in a very healthy manner, and then the rest of your joints. And next one, what we talk about, that will be towards the functional and functional training. So you can see up here what we talk about, and this is very important to understand, that going into the gym is not necessarily functional. Because if you think about it, in a day we have let's say you're going to work and you're driving for 30 minutes. Then you're going into your work, and just like I'm doing right now, and I'm going to be sitting then after that for many, many hours with you as well, we're going to sit for another 8 hours. So that's 8.5 hours. And then I have to go back to home, and that's going to be another half an hour. So that's already put you into 9 hours in a hip flexion position. And that's already 9 hours. Then let's say if you go to the gym on top of that, and then you're going to go on a leg extension machine, just like we see it up here. And what's happening? Again, we're sitting down, and let's say most of your workout is designed, because it was designed by the gym instructor, and it's kind of this very basic workout. It's designed, let's say, in 80% of on the machines. That's, again, it's not functional, because again, you continuously put the person in a hip flexion position. So that's, and you know yourself what that's called. So it's kind of like we have already iliopsoas tightness, or the hip flexor tightness, and we also dealing with, as we have the iliopsoas tightness, we actually dealing also with the problem sometimes having the lower back tightness, hamstrings, and then the person has a quite big issues to be a functional. So you see that, if you see that photo, does that make kind of feeling it as a functional? Now, we have it up here, overhead squats. So I say up here, before anyone, that's a big problem as well with performing overhead squats, because it's a massive, massive progression. Is it functional? 100%, because are we reaching over? Yes, we do. Are we squatting? Yes. But combining those two together is a different game, because not everyone is able to reach same time and squat same time because of the dysfunctions we have it. Should we be able to perform it, each of us? Yes, if we wouldn't get dysfunctions. And unfortunately, very little people are having minimum dysfunctions. So you can see, in order for the person to be able to go so low, we're talking about the ankle to be mobile, the knees to be stable. Then we talk about the hips again to be mobile. The thoracic spine has to be stable again. And then we talk about the shoulder to be stable, and glenohumeral to be mobile. So it's very important that up here we are talking about also the load. As we exaggerate the load over the shoulder level, we talk about extra 30% of extra weight as you're lifting that over your head. So then there's a massive pressure onto the core. And let's say we talk about pelvis and your rib cage relationship. So for example, your hips and your rib cage, it has to be in the right pattern. So the ribs has to be down and supporting your core, because they're supporting the internal organs. And then you want to make sure that the pelvis able to maintain the relationship between it. So it's very, very hard exercise to perform. What we call as functional, yes, it's functional once you perform it in a daily life. Now, single leg squatting, will we call that functional? Is it really functional? How often do we go, actually, if you think about it also, how often would you go into that kind of position? Not really. Does it look good? Absolutely amazing. Does she has a strong core, great mobility? Yes, 100%. But this is not something what you'll be doing in the daily routines. So number one, remember, it has to be the fundamental. Now we have it up here, little photo of the guy who is actually squatting, which I would never recommend it, because remember, those Swiss balls are able to perform, you're holding your weight only up to 110 kg. A basic Swiss ball is able to hold the weight of the human body weight. And then anything like more specialized balls are being up to 150 maximum. When we talk about his body weight plus the plates he's lifting, that he's definitely well over that. So this is already a hazard. So this is not necessarily functional. There is absolutely no need for performing that, because bringing unstable environment on overloaded joints is not necessarily a functional. Okay, and now we're gonna go up here. So then we have a why. Research shows machines are not best to transfer performance in the real world. Popularity of machines, particularly in the athletic area, is declining. So obviously any athletes will not perform too many exercises on the machines unless we talk about bodybuilding. Machines neglect 3 key grounds of stability. So deep abdominals, we're not using them. Hip, abductors and rotators, scapular stabilizations. So it's very important when it talks about scapular stabilizations, there is a few muscles which are there involved in it. So we have a infraspinatus, and then you have a suprascapularis, teres minor, and subscapularis. They are all involved in the shoulder stabilization. So lots of people don't train rotary cuff muscles, and they are very, 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 so glenohumeral joints up here. And it's very important to train the rotary cuff, because most of people, if you think about it, how can you have that shoulder in the right position if you have just for example, like me, because of dysfunction of the sports, sometimes sports cause dysfunctions as well. So some of the sports will cause dysfunctions when you actually overdevelop anterior deltoid. There's a weakness of the posterior deltoid, and also maybe weakness of the latissimus dorsi, and also a trapezius. So what's happening up here is important that your shoulder is not going to be the ball and the socket when we talk about the shoulder. It's not going to be the joint. It's not going to be the right position. It's going to be out of the line once there's one of the muscles is tightening. So for example, let's say you have a tight chest and you have anterior deltoid overdeveloped. It's going to pull the shoulder out of the hinge. Okay, so out of the ball out of the socket. So that's important that we keep that in line. Function training benefits: build strength, get lean, improve flexibility, room, balance, core, can be adjusted for level, especially with it. Suspension training can be done anywhere. So when we talk about suspension training, I train a lot of clients on T-Rex, and this is number one for me to start with, even a beginner client. Number one is important with the suspension training because number one, they're dealing with their own body weight. They're dealing also with a little bit of balance because they need to be able to balance their body as they're holding into the T-Rex. They need to learn how to become stable. They need to learn how to actually engage the core and how to perform the movement. So T-Rex, like T-Rex, suspension trainer, any kind of type of suspension trainer is actually a great way to start off with the beginner client. But also if your client is an athlete, then definitely it's going to benefit the client because they can still build the endurance on it. They can still develop the strength on it. And they can also develop stability, core control, and balance. So from here, we're going to move on to the next one. And now that's number one. So functional training, the ingredient. So it's very important for a person to be soft tissue quality. Restriction on a proper length tension relationship. So any kind of restriction in the body. So for example, if your fascia, it's tight, so the sleeve fascia, what we call it, the sleeve for the muscle, if that's tight, it's going to restrict the movement. Then if that, another thing is what we have, but if let's say if the muscle is also shortened, then does restriction the movement. So it's very important that we're looking at soft tissue quality. So you can see into it, like making sure that the person before, if you see any kind of restriction on the client, so you have two ways you can do it. You can send them to massage therapists, or you can get them to actually start doing soft tissue quality by performing exercise. For example, for my over 40, when we're using the special magic trigger point ball, when we're using a foam rollers, that would be ways to get the client to work on the soft tissue quality. So when they're performing, they feel loose. That there's a magic happening once you actually use that ball to kind of do a little bit of mobilization. So what's happening, you do soft tissue therapy on it a little bit by yourself. So auto massage, for example, and it's actually have a great outcome on the way the soft tissue is actually the soft tissue quality. And then the person is able to perform movements they haven't been able to do it in years. So definitely soft tissue quality is number one. You can't force on restrictions. So that's number one. Movement competency. So posture, mobility, stability. So for example, if we have a person and the posture is not great, okay, there's a lot of tightness restrictions, the person is a little bit immobile, and then there's a stability issues as well, then that needs to be addressed as well for the person, and has to be strongly addressed. So that again, it comes to that lovely workout of my 40 when we actually work on all these components. Multi-planar training. So which one we call it is integrated multi-dimensional, multi-directional, multi-planar movement, also refers to 3D training. So that's very important, 3-dimensional training. So when we're using all different plans of motion, so we actually have 5 of them. So remember, when we have a front, we have to train the clients in all different plans. So let's say we say the mainstream, and we have actually 5 of them. So we have a frontal plan, we have a sagittal plan, and a transfer plan. We have also parasagittal plan and oblique plan. So that's why we would train the client in that all patterns once you train it to make that functional, because the client has to be able to rotate. The client has to be able to go sideways. The client has to be able to go back, stand, and flex. So it's important that you always, when you implement a full workout for the client, full body workout, that you do the 3-dimensional training. Core always engage stability, center of the gravity, and strength. The body does nothing of muscles, only the movement. The body is constantly activating any array of muscles and the pattern of the coordinating which muscles lose the identity. So Carl Bobs, that's what he said about it. So body knows about movement. And sometimes it's easier to teach the body the movement than actually about engaging certain muscles. So let's say bodybuilding would be concentrating on isolating muscles and working in certain muscles. When we talk about functional patterns and functional movements and training, we talk about movement first, then we talk about movement and muscles engagement. And function training. So now pyramid, and this is very important. Like you have the same when you have the foot pyramid, you need to implement this. So optimum performance training, they strongly about that. How do we really train the client? And it's very, very important that we implement it first. And that's why we forget to do it a lot. You can see it in the gyms, that this goes straight to the strength, power, and speed. That people forget to train mobility, stability, strength, power, and speed. And that's the only reason was because as a species, we don't like to do things which are uncomfortable for us. And we don't like to do things which are challenge us, and we look silly in doing them. So for example, if someone is not able to perform something, they rather just to skip it, brush it under the carpet, as simple as performing a squat. And if you have an inflexible ankle, what we do, we stick 2 plates under the heels and making the person just to do squat, correct? And that's easy, just to masking the problem instead working on it. And it's very, very important that once we performing the training, you need to, once you're going to do proper screening, you will see it, that the person has to be able to perform the exercise correctly. And once they are immobile and they have a problem with mobility and stability, then they should not go ever to the strength training before they even work on it. Then they have to move on towards the power if they wish, and the speed as well as the very last. So never forget about working mobility and stability with your training with your clients once you actually do the training patterns with the client. And there's many different ways to implement it. Okay, so now, okay, functional training, organizing the workouts. So assess and screen. So number one, see where is your client standing from, because what's, for example, what you would consider as a norm, he might be slightly out of norm and you need to address it. So it's very important that you assess the client and screen the client to see where we're coming from. Don't forget that once you assess and screen the client, that you do address any kind of injuries they had in the past, because that would restrict the movements. They would also change the pattern, the way your client moves. And it's very, very important that we implement all of it. So, because that would give you lots of history of your client, is giving you a lot of clues why your client, the way they move. Sometimes clients forget that they fall or jump on the one leg they were a few years ago and forget to tell you about it. So it's very important when we're assessing and we're screening, we're paying attention to everything what's slightly out of norm. Foam rolling, soft tissue work, very important. Foam rolling, trigger point ball as well. So trigger therapy point, very important to make sure that we actually implement it into the training. Mobility and movement preparation. So, think about it. What kind of mobility exercise and we could use easy as resistance bands to improve the mobility of the client. So sometimes we need to do a little bit different tools just to improve the mobility of the client, to perform that movements and to have them to perform the movements, because sometimes they might not have that. So they need proprioception sometimes. Sometimes very often the client needs an extra tool just to be able, or even a wall, just to be able to actually feel. Once the client is able to feel, is able to recruit the right muscles, and as well is the way the neurons works. So core activation and prehab. So for example, very often, even last week, I just seen it when I was doing my own workout with the clients. I have seen other group walking. They were doing functional training in the park, and they were walking, and they were doing extending the arms. So they had like kind of, let's say, overhead, and they were just doing walking. So what my problem is on that, I understand that they want to try to work on stability of the shoulder and strength of the shoulder. But my problem is when that, if we don't address where the ribcage should be falling in and where the hips should be falling in, and if they have some dysfunctions, we're going to cause more strain and more harm onto the back of the clients, because they're not able to control it. This is very advanced. Anything what you're lifting, the higher this goes above your center of the gravity, then harder is for you is going to be to control it. So number one, where is the ribcage position? Where is your pelvis position? How they move, how the spine moves. So anything what you lift, I would not recommend to any of your clients to start lifting weights over the head until they have core strength really developed. So, and activated, of course. Main part of the workout and functional progressions, functional pyramid. So remember, we work with what? Stability, mobility, then we were going to the strength, then we're going to the power and the speed. So remember to slowly progress the workout, not to rush into it, and then implement it, all parts of it slightly in the workout. So now functional training. We have a functional training process. For example, we have a squat. And again, you don't necessarily have to be overhead squat. This is a functional movement. And the right movement is, they teach you a lot in the classes to get a 90-degree angle just behind the knees. And that's just for safety, just in case the person is losing the balance, the person has some kind of problems, issues with the knees and maybe hips and maybe restrictions. But ideally, if you think about it, going onto the toilet in Italy, I think so, there's a few other countries, when you go and for hygiene reasons, you have a hole in the ground when we go in, and that's when it requires you to proper squat. So we actually design to do a proper squat position, and a squat position is not 90 angle behind the knees, to keep that in mind. So it's always important that the person when they're squatting, you hear a lot of codes saying sit on a chair. Unfortunately, this is not the right code, because that the person is going to stop to a certain level. When you explain to them to sit as you would go to the toilet, then they would go a little bit lower, and that was the right pattern. And we are designed, so if someone tells you this is not functional, it's very functional to be able to go squat whole way down. So now functional training, joint by joint approach. So we have it up here, the red circles, you have it up here, joint stability, which are and joint mobility. So joint stability, what is it? So joint stability, ability to maintain and control joint movement or position. This is achieved by synergistic action of the components of the joint, muscle, ligament, joint capsule, and the neuromuscular system must never compromise the joint mobility. So it's very important that once the joint has to be stable, so it has to maintain that relationship. Joint mobility, the range of uninhibited movement around the joint body segment. This is also achieved by synergistic action of the joint components, neuromuscular system, and also must never compromise in joint stability. So when we talk about mobility, the joint must be mobile. So the joint has to be able to move through the range of motion. The joint has to be stable, has to be able to work with the muscles, ligaments, and capsules, and hold it. The nervous system has to be able to hold it in the right position. So now you have it up here where we talk about mobile, stable. You have it up here again. So now the best way is to maybe write down for yourself and just even make a circle, or like make a little human, and which joint has to be mobile, which one has to be stable, for you to remember that. Now look at that stability on the lumbar spine, on your elbows, on your knee, and the front of your foot. So that's very important. So the ankle has to be mobile, but the toes has to be stable. And most of people have a problem to keep the toes down. Very often people has a problem when whenever they exercise they do. That already tells you there's a little bit of dysfunctions when they, let's say there's a hole always in the big toe on your runners, or there's a hole with it coming to the side. So that means that you have a problem with the stability towards your tarsals, the metatarsals. Then next thing, what we talk about, the mobility has to be in the ribs. Very important that the hip is mobile. And then elbows has to be stable. The shoulder has to be mobile. The glenohumeral joint up here has to be also stable, mobile onto the shoulder. And then thoracic spine has to be mobile. So you see, a lot of people has a very immobile, because of the daily functions, we have a very immobile thoracic spine. So what's happening, we're sitting at the desk, we're rounding the shoulders. So first of all, the shoulder comes in out of the socket. Second thing, we have a quiet thoracic spine becomes immobile, we're rounding it in that position. And then we have a hip. And most of people, when they're sitting down, the knee would be higher than the hip. And this becomes a really big deflection up here. And that becomes another issue up here. Comes to the wrist mobility. Most of us doesn't have it because it's just not required from the daily lifestyle. And most of us just typing, and there's a lot of problems with the forearms as well in the future. Comes to the ankle. If you think about the females, most of them is maybe even just a dress conduct for most of jobs when the women has to wear high heels. So that's kind of like put you in the plantar flexion of the foot all the time. So it's hard to see that there's going to be good mobility in the ankle. And then the knees, we're dealing with the knock knees and stuff like that. So that's definitely not stable as well. So what we have up here, you can write down maybe for yourself if you want to. So function training mobility. So we have ankle needs to be mobile. So you need to be able to dorsiflex your ankle. So that's me. There's also, if you think about that, that needs to be also relationship between the calcaneal bone. So the bone at the back of the foot has to be also mobile in order for you. If that's stiff, that's not going mobile. So you have your tibia, you have the calcaneal bone, then you have the tarsals, metatarsals. So it's kind of like, it's very important that the ankle also works with the relationship between the ankle and that calcaneal bone at the bottom as well, that it has to be a function up here when they have to be able to dorsiflex. The hip has to be able to be mobile. So now most of us, if it's restriction of the movement, because let's say we love to cross the legs and our adductors become very, very tight, then there's a problem as well with mobility because it's restricting the mobility of the hip. Again, we have a problem when the joint does not stay in the socket. Thoracic spine, as I said, the function of our sitting down and not being able to move it through it, not be able to rotate from the thoracic spine as well, then there's a big problem as well. It becomes into all the time into the flexion. Shoulder, glenohumeral joint as well needs to be mobile. And that's again because of the posture of lots of people has carrying a lot of muscles and a stress. They're calling they actually they store it in the shoulders, so that's kind of restricting the movement. So that's kind of again is out of position. And then the wrist, again, typing us doesn't request for us to be any mobile. So we have it up here, function training, improvement of the posture. So for example, that's a very nice one. I love to always see this one because of the head itch in your temple, the creak in your neck, the itch in your back, the stiffness in your knee, and discomfort in your heel. So you can see if the person is slightly out of balance, and it can cause any issues. And now we need to assess the client really well to be able to say, is it from the top part of the chain or is from the bottom of the chain? 90% of the time is probably your hips. It's probably your hips, and that's something that's probably with the hips, but not always. And that's your body is very smart. So in order for you to become quiet, looking like perfect straight, that's me. You need to start compensating with other body parts. So for example, lots of people I work with it, for example, they have a shorter foot. So for them, in order to drop it down, drop the hip, and then stimulate onto the upper chain just to make sure that they actually feel even. Body has an amazing way of compensating just to make sure that you become kind of functional. So you're able to perform and you're able to function still. So it's very important to see where is this coming from. Is it descending or is it ascending? So up here we have a function training, the importance of the posture. So lower cross syndrome. So on that, a lot of that, you're going to see it now with people because of the way we sitting down. Again, been lots of Zooms, lots of online studies not helping. So tight muscles, iliopsoas muscles, rectus femoris, adductors, latissimus dorsi, erector spinae, quadratus lumboris. Okay, so we have it up here. So is your tight, is your hip, is your lower back, and then you have your big muscles onto your biggest muscles on the back as well, latissimus dorsi up here. That's the tight muscles. Then we have the weak muscles. We have the rectus abdominis, so it's the muscles on the front of your core, transverse abdominis, the deeper muscles, obliques, and the glutes. So that's the number one for you to address. If you see a person when the head is slightly forward, the back slightly hinged back, and the hips comes forward, and let's say the bum is kind of like a tilting slightly forward, so it's a posterior pelvic tilt on the hips. We kind of want to address that we're working with lower cross syndrome, and you need to. So what do you need to do in a case like that when you see that? So when you see the muscles which are there tight, what do you need to do? You need to stretch them. You need to make sure that they become more mobile. So you would apply soft tissue work on that. You would apply also for maybe some active stretching, and maybe through the movement. So you will create movements which will help them to also to stretch. The weak muscles needs to be strengthened. So again, we have, when we talk about rectus abdominis, transverse abdominis, obliques, glutes, what kind of exercise you can design when that becomes more functional, when we actually can strengthen that area. And then, so we have up here all the overactive, so you can see this kind of cross syndrome. So what we have it. So if your abs are weak, your glutes are weak, simple as that. If your deep hip flexor muscles are too tight, your lower back is probably too tight too. Because if you think about the various attachments of the psoas muscles, that will cause anterior pelvic tilt as well. Okay. And then we have it up here, function training, Then we have the importance of posture, so upper cross syndrome. And then you deal with sometimes with it as well. Sometimes you deal with kind of a combination of both. So we have an upper cross syndrome. So we have tight muscles pectoralis, so that's the muscles on your chest, upper trapezius up here, levator scapula, and sternocleidomastoids, the muscles on the neck. Lots of people lately comes into the clinics and they cannot turn the neck, and the arm flexors as well. So that will cause you, again, because of the sitting down for many hours, tapping, forward position, restriction of the movement, and seizing up. Weak muscles, we talk about rhomboids, middle and lower trapezius, posterior rotator cuff, and arm extensors. And that's the one when I would request for this to do a lot to strengthen up, also from the back up here. Not many people do rotary cuff exercises, and sometimes when they actually perform rotary cuff exercises, they are doing too light or they're performing them too heavy, so they're not engaging the right muscles. So it's very important that it's done in the right pattern. And up here, let me see. Functional training, promise of the posture domino effect. The hips move forward, changing the center of gravity alignment. The compensate upper body drifts backwards. The compensate upper body moves, hips tilt forward. And that's what we deal a lot lately, that person has, because if you think about when you work with the screen, very often from the working on screen, we have a little letters and stuff like that. Sometimes the vision is affected. We're gonna start bringing the head forward. Another thing that let's keep in mind, young generations look into the phone. It's a lot of that. So they're training the head by looking down into the phones. Then you have it up here. So once they do, even like bringing your head down, it's going to cause me to weaken and rounded my shoulders. And then comes in in order for you to be able to so we have an anterior pelvic tilt to be able to maintain kind of like positions that you're actually able to function. So remember, body has a great ways of dealing with your dysfunctions and masking them. So for a long time, you're not going to feel the outcomes of the bad posture until it gets really bad, and it will seize up. Functional training, the importance of posture, the other postural disorientations. So now forward shoulders, posterior pelvic tilt, that happens as well. So we have anterior pelvic tilt, posterior pelvic tilt, and the forward head. We need to address it to it. And knocked knees. Knocked knees very often as well. That could be to do with the hips a lot, but also very often that comes in from core. So for example, let's say if you think about it, your hips, and then is your knees and your feet. When you're dealing with the body weight, holding the body weight, let's say if the core is not strong enough, everything falls down to the hips and the knees and the feet. So in order for you to be able to even hold yourself all together, your knees comes into the inward position just for you in order to stay stable. Okay, to stay stable. Once the core becomes stronger, your knees will start rotating externally and also work on the hips. Functional training, the importance of posture. So muscles imbalance, poor posture, improper movement, because once you have the person in improper posture, it's very hard to recruit the right movement. And then we have a problem with injury. So number one, actually, I'm with you. I might actually show you something. And now that's something, I don't know how many trainings in Ireland you can do on that. I do a lot of, if you want to straight up someone, instead sending them, let's say you work with scoliosis, also you work with the kyphosing and stuff like that. This is a yoga wheel. And that's number one of warm-up pattern for my clients when we're using a yoga wheel to straighten up the spine. I have proofs, I have photos, how with the 2 to 3 months, you can straighten up a spine of the person by using a few exercises on yoga wheel to work on that muscle. So what you do as well, this is kind of a little bit like a foam rolling. This is actually a cork one, so it's slightly harder than normal. You can get the foam one as well. So they are not as severe on the spine. Of course, you need to know and you have a medical background to kind of like, and then any kind of training to be able to use them, and also yoga training. But ideally, they do massively helps if the person is in a offside, or let's say if the back is curved, anything like that. So you want to actually straighten them up, because you see, you can recruit right muscles once the person is actually, you can see side position, lying position, because you will actually, if they're off balance, if they're off center, it's impossible for you to recruit the right way, any kind of patterns. What can you do, even if you're not qualified? You can actually implement a unilateral training. So when we're going to actually start training on the one side in order to say bilateral training, and that's the only way I can see it for you to actually improve the person. And we're going to be talking about that a little bit more. Function training as a core. So for example, again, keep it in mind. I have a few clients, and just because they are lean does not mean that the core is strong. Everyone has a six-pack, and six-pack is visual due to low fat index, not due to core strength. Now, someone have a deeper, someone has a lower core strength. Doesn't have really, very often, yes, of course, they will have a strong core, but very often those people who just have a six-pack, they don't necessarily have the power and the strength in the core. They have a low fat index, and keep it in mind, just because it looks strong doesn't mean it's strong. Function training as a core, and I always say another thing is you have lots of the kind of like perfect shape when we have the V shape, and then we have the legs. I haven't seen in my life a strong tree with a little trunk. So if it's a little trunk, it's impossible for them to be strong. Just doesn't make no sense. So it has to be, if you think about the difference between the bodybuilders, when they have a tiny waist and they're using, normally they use a belt to keep the waist very narrow. So the latissimus dorsi looks bigger and the back looks bigger. And then you have a CrossFitter, for example, person who actually really builds on the core strength. There's a big difference on the size of the trunk. So that's the difference between that. So if I could say which one has a stronger core, I would say definitely the CrossFitter. Then we have a function training, a core. The core is defined as a lumbar-pelvic hip complex. It's located in the center of the gravity where the movement begins. And then we have it up here, the efficiency of the core allows for maintains neutral force couples, group of muscles moving together to move the joint. Maintains the optimal orthokinematics, convex to concave, and maintains the optimal efficiency in an entire kinetic chain during the movement. Acceleration to acceleration, dynamic stabilization. Proximal stability of the movement in the distal segment of the body. So that's one we want to make sure that all of them are applied in for you in order to have a strong core. So if any of them, if the person is not able to stabilize the spine, and very often that's what you can see when they're performing the plank, they're falling down with the lumbar spine, they're not able to engage the transverse abdominis, they're not able to engage the rectus abdominis, they're falling down. That means they're not engaging enough muscles to pull on the joint as well. Everything has to work together. So it's very important. We call it cylinder. So you can see it. And then that's the way I always like for the students actually to remember that, how we have them, the lovely can. And it's easy to remember. So you have at the top, you have a diaphragm. At the bottom, you have a pelvic floor. You have a transfer abdominis on the front, and you have a multifidus at the back. So they all have to work together. You have to have it open, and from the top you have to close, and from the bottom you have to close. So the pelvic floor has to be strong as well. And then from the sides you need to stabilize it. So that's what we consider as a strong core. So the diaphragm, pelvic floor. So from the top you have a diaphragm, from the bottom you have a pelvic floor, you have a multifidus at the back, there's the muscles on the back, and the transverse abdominis are at the front. So you can't have it, if one of those components is missing, you will have a problem because the person will not be able to stabilize it. So all of that has to be addressed. So for example, you can't expect a woman after having a baby within even 6 months, sometimes depends on what we talk about, how she recovered quickly, and how was her core strength previous to having been in labor. She does not have a strong pelvic floor, so she will not use her core to stabilize it and get it stronger. So when she's performing, let's say full plank, and she's performing that from the wrist, she does not feel that on the core. She does not feel it. She feels a lot of pressure on her shoulders. She feels a lot of pressure on her neck and her wrist, because all what she's trying to do, she tries to put the upper body weight and pressing through her upper body weight instead of actually using her core, because over there, she's not healed yet and she's not ready. So there's a specialized exercise you should supposed to perform for the clients after labor as well. Also, you might be dealing with their diastasis rectus as well for a person who has a separation of abdomen muscles. Anyone who has like up here, if you think about it, doesn't matter. It could be a problem with the person who's been sitting down for 20 years, maybe it's drug driving or any kind of sitting down job. Let's say the diet wasn't the greatest, they gain lots of weight, especially men very often, they can get hernia as well. And it's very important. So that's also diastasis rectus. So that's kind of like the internal organs comes through it. Very important that yes, as a fitness professionals, we once you have a correct training, you're able to, with a certain exercise to heal the person. If not, please refer them to physiotherapists. And ideally, you want to all the exercise. You want to make sure, first of all, remember that you cannot have the can. So you're not supposed to do overhead movements once up here, once the transfer abdomens are not able to hold on. So you have to be very smart how you perform the movement on a person when they have a weak core, when she has a weak pelvic floor, because anything over pressing from the top is going to cause more damage and it's going to cause widening, because one of the worst, the 4 ingredients, which are the diaphragm, multifidus, transfer abdominis, and the pelvic floor, needs to work together. One of the components is missing, you have an unstable house. Unstable house is going to go down and you're going to cause more damage. So remember, you need to strengthen up all of these areas before you go any farther. And also is important when you implement gravity, remember that the training does not need to be overload, can be done in many different ways, but the gravity is number one. So sometimes instead of overloading clients, I see a lot of instructors putting lots of weights on the clients, maybe work with the gravity and work against the gravity. And that's just going to be good enough for the client to get stronger in that area. Function training, putting it all together. So we have observed the posture and screen the movement. So for example, if you see anything which you're not happy with, it's very important when you screen the client that the client is in the shorts and let's say a sports bra, that you're actually able to see everything that's what's going on. So let's say if you see maybe the rib one is higher, one is lower, when you see that maybe you won't be able to see a screen correctly a client unless you have a lot of experience to actually see if they have a scoliosis straight away, just looking on them. You would have to actually lift the t-shirt, especially if they have a baggy clothes, you won't be able to see it. So it's important that they have to be actually certain clothing for you to actually observe the posture and screen the movement, undress them, socks as well, because that would indicate for you there's a flattened, we might be dealing with a flat feet. And once we're dealing with the flat feet, there will be a lot of things going on as well, because that's mean the arch collapse. So then automatically we have a inversion of the ankles, and we might be dealing with anything higher onto the chain. So it's important that you actually have a client as a little clothing as possible. Screen the movement. So just make sure like you get them to perform overhead squat. That's number one, would be probably to just obviously no weights. You can use the broomsticks if you wish. You can use the hands to perform that movement. Screen the movement as they're performing normal, competing any kind of movement, how they walk, how they actually performing a normal squats, how they're performing lunges, how they're actually doing push-ups. You're going to gather a lot of information from that. And define asymmetries and weaknesses. So you want to make sure that you highlight it. And number one, set the short-term goal, priorities, corrective exercises. So for example, you want to implement it to the training. Let's say the client comes in and the client needs to have a functional training design which equals purpose. So for example, it needs to fit into what he wants to do in the future. So for example, if your client comes in and they say they come for aesthetics, they come for cosmetic look, and then you find lots of dysfunctions in them, you need to address first and try to persevere your client to work on the dysfunctions before you actually start working on the long-term goal for the client. So remember, that's why we say short-term goals, priorities, corrective exercise comes number one. So long-term goals, progression, strength work, and prehab. And once you get the client into being a functional as they're able to perform the exercise, then we can talk a little bit about overload. So next one. We have a functional training and we have the path. Okay. So that should go. Unfortunately, I cannot see up here. So I will tell you this way because I can see only arrows, but I cannot turn that on. Am I right? No. So if they have a right pattern, if you can see that, let's say they perform overhead squats, it's the right pattern, then we going into the progressions, which will be strength. Then we work on progressions. We work on this, designing a corrective exercises. If the client, let's say, for example, you've seen a lot of dysfunctions, you can see that they need to apply prehab work first. You work on the prehab before you work on the progressions and the strength. Okay, so you always first correct it, and then you're moving out from it. So when the functional training organization, we have a soft tissue work. So we have a foam rolling, is amazing. Same as using trigger point balls as doing the auto massage. Mobility and flexibility training, it needs to be. So remember, when we talk about mobility, we talk about the joint. When we talk about flexibility, we talk about lengthening of the muscles. And movement prehab core activation, main part of the workout. So movement. So for example, the core activation, it should be always, when you design, let's say 3 days of workout, you want to make sure that one of those exercises, when you performed on each of them, is a core activation and then prehab for the client. Functional progressions, and then up here we have a functional patterns, supplementary. So supplementary would be one of the exercises. When we talk about supplementary, we talk about, let's say, if the client is right leg dominate, probably the size of the left quad is going to be slightly smaller. So supplementary, that means that the right leg is going to be stronger, because let's say it's the dominant leg in the soccer playing, let's say it's the one which is dominant and is always going to kick. That means that the client, in order for it to be in a balance, needs to work on the left leg to have the muscles in balance. So your supplementary work would be, when you perform that supplementary work right up here, it would be to perform extra, for example, single leg deadlifts, or it would be single leg lunges onto the left side to get that in balance, the muscles in balance. Functional training, and we have overhead assessment, functional competency screening. So see, where are you standing with your clients as they're performing that? How they're scoring, let's say on depth of the squat, how they're scoring on a torso position, how they're scoring on the arms falling into the right position. So if the client is not falling into the right direction, the position with any of those, you need to implement, and you can score them from 1 to 3, for example. And you can see, you can say that 1, it would be very poor, 2 is medium level, and a 3 that is outstanding, if you wish. And it's up to you, or whatever way you want to work, whatever way it's going to actually work really well for you. But just want to make sure that every single time when you reassess, for example, with the 6 weeks, you reassess the client, that you can see a great improvement. Soft tissue work, foam rolling, very important, that we always address that. Very often your clients has because of the, let's say, 8 hours of sitting down at the desk, they have a lower back tightness. Just keep it in mind that we're not allowed to actually foam roll the client onto the lumbar spine. You can roll him anywhere else, but then you cannot, because of the proprioceptions, how you actually putting some of the muscles gently to sleep as you actually do the soft tissue work. Your lower back will become a little bit too soft. And what we want to remember, which one of them has to be strong and stable, is we can have a little bit more softness and onto the thoracic spine, but the lumbar spine has to stay tight. Has to stay tight enough for the client to be able to hold him as they perform the squat in the right position. Let's say they do back squat, they're putting load onto the lower back, onto the middle back. They need to make sure that the trunk stays strong. So if you foam roll your trunk, unfortunately, you're going to a little bit stimulate the muscles, and they can become, the soft tissue is going to be a little bit too soft, and that's going to be not necessarily cause the injury, but there might be a little bit disadvantage for the client. I would strongly not recommend to do foam rolling afterwards. 100%, if they perform as full sets of work, then you can foam roll the lower back as well, but just not before they perform the exercise, not in the warm-up. Corrective exercise. So anything else what has to be applied. So for example, if you feel that the person is not in the right position, that the shoulders are not rolling in the right positions, what kind of corrective exercise can you apply for the client to open up the chest? What exercise can you apply for the client to strengthen up the middle of the back? And that would be concept. Door squat. So for example, that's very hard to perform. So when we talk about door squat, we're falling into the front of that. So we're standing beside the door, we're stretching the arms over the head, and we're trying to squat down as low as we can without losing the balance. And this is a really a great test to see how well do you squat. That's a really good exercise as well for functional training for the client. The only thing is keep in mind that they do not reinforce it on the client once it's actually they try to compensate so much that the lower back starts hurts. So they should be stopping on the position when it becomes discomfort. Counterweight plate squat. Up here, this plate squat, when we talk about it, when we did progression and regressions, with the plate squat is very important because the extra weight on the front of the body, the counterbalance for your lack of mobility in the ankle and as well your core, it helps you to become more stable. Squat to arm raise. So try to get your clients to perform this from squat to the overhead, the arm raise. So with dorsiflexion. So you want to perform the exercise when we actually can apply dorsiflexion up here. So how do you actually gonna come against the door, maybe towards the door, bend your front knee and lean forward and just kind of learn how to perform the more dorsiflexion of the ankle. Also, I do recommend to work with the kettlebell and the resistance bands and dorsiflex your foot. Okay, and we have progressions and regression and suspension training. Vector principle is so the body weight versus body angle. High body position, easier. Lower body position, harder. Like for example, low row. So when we go, let's say for example, under the anchor point becomes harder because you're going to go towards more horizontal position. That means that's more load going against your body. So we said about using the gravity. Pendulum principle, center under the anchor, easier, farther away for the harder. Hamstring curls. So for example, if we're doing lying down position hamstring curls, if we're moving ourselves away from the anchor point as we're performing lying down hamstring curls, that becomes a hard exercise. If you're closer to the anchor point, then it's easier. But remember, that's slightly different, pendulum principle, when you actually working with vector principle. Very different when you do on the blow rows. Plans of movement, sagittal, so body weight. So for example, we have a free weight body weight, curl and lunge. Frontal, side to the side, for example, side lunge. Transfer, rotation, abdominal adduction, chest flight, wood chops. Position, we have it up here is a facing away, facing down prone, facing up supine, sideways. Feet, we have a split stance, feet apart, feet together, single foot, ball of the foot. And each of those positions is going to make it harder or easier for you. You know yourself, if we have a split stance, it's easier. Feet apart is easy. Feet together already, the center of the gravity is going to be harder to maintain. Single foot, that's very hard. Ball of the foot is also quite challenging for the client. Single leg, ball of the foot as well, that's very challenging for the client. So, and then we have a functional courses, which we always recommend it for you to actually do it once you perform the functional. So we have a mobility and flexibility. Probably, I think so most of you probably have done this one. So we have basic exercise technique. You have a kettlebell, indoor cycling instruction, aqua aerobics, Myra 40. That would be the one I would strongly recommend it for you. And then we have a scaling workouts, cardio fitness programming, suspension training, and resistance band is coming soon, and a feet ball exercise. And they are very important as well. We have done some of them as a part of our progressions and regressions. So do you have any questions on the end today? Do you have any questions of the presentation? Is there anything what you would like to ask for? Anyone? Is it straightforward? Did you find it easy? Yes? No one has any questions about it?